You're almost there, honey.
I sure hope I am.
Calvin? You must be more careful.
Thanks. You're a lifesaver.
Like Ryan?
Huh?
Never mind. Why so many boxes?
Calvin is visiting the rest of his family for a bit.
Really?
Yep. That way, I can be here with you guys on Christmas Day.
How many siblings do you have?
Hey, I was my parents' ninth, after all.
How the fuck? Cthulhu's got the sex drive of a god.
Don't talk about my dad's sex drive. I'm begging you.
We were trying to pack all these gifts into the van outside.
Did you fucking steal the van again?
No. Mistress hasn't stolen anything. To my knowledge, Calvin's brother Klaus lent us his van so we can make the trip.
Oh. Well, that was nice of him.
We're headed out today so we can be there in time, have a day or two there, then come back and be here in time to celebrate Christmas Day with you all.
Hey, do you think you could help us pack this stuff into the van?
Sure. I don't see why not.
I'm helping too.
And you're doing great, sweetie! You all have fun on your trip. You take care of my baby, okay?
Will do.
I'll miss you, Barbara. Have fun with Calvin's family. And be safe, okay?
I will, ma'am. We'll be back in a few days. Promise.
Excellent. With that, I'll have to head to my chambers because I still have some work I need to get done before the holidays. Good luck with that. Sword of the Berserk, Guts Rage, known as Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc, Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion in Japan, was a Dreamcast exclusive based on the legendary manga series Berserk by man, myth, and legend himself, Kentaro Miura, released in the year 1999 in Japan, with a Western localization happening a year later in the year 2000. This game is not adapting any specific chapter or part of the manga, as its story takes place in the space between volumes 22 and 23. It's essentially the video game equivalent to those anime movies that are original stories that aren't necessarily canon but also aren't non-canon per se, like the Cowboy Bebop movie for example. This game, fun fact, was the first piece of Berserk media released in the US as it released in America in 2000 as previously stated. But some of y'all are probably thinking, but what about the 1997 OVA? Oh, you mean the 1997 anime that didn't release in the States until 2002? That one? Yeah, the 1987 OVA wouldn't be released in the US until 2002 by Media Blasters with an English dub, and the manga wouldn't be localized by Dark Horse until the year 2003. So, yeah, the timeline lines up. This game was in fact America's first taste of the legend that is Berserk. That probably explains the really bizarre name. Sword of the Berserk Guts Rage is such an odd title. I have to wonder what was going through their head. Did they think it sounded cooler or some shit? Anyway, the game was developed by Yuke's, but was published by Eidos Interactive in Western territories, while ASCII did the Japanese publication. Yuke's, the developer, is probably best known for WWE games. You know WWE, that thing that showed up in a few Scooby-Doo movies. You know the ones, don't act like you fucking don't. They also have their hands in some non-wrestling games like EOE and Evil Zone. Eidos, meanwhile, you probably know for Soul Reaver and Tomb Raider. Well, that does explain a few things. Oh, and ASCII is the company behind the MSX. You guys know what the MSX is, right? It's that 80s era home computer that was really popular in Japan. It was the system the first two Metal Gear games were on, like the actual first two games as in pre-Metal Gear Solid first two Metal Gear games. Yeah, see, I told you that you knew. I should probably get into the fairly odd way I went about playing this game for this video. That is to say that I played the game's original Japanese release via an English fan patch by someone going by Vinny, who by the way is on Twitter. This was my primary way of playing the game, and is thus the version I'm primarily reviewing. I did check out the US release as well, but outside of localization stuff, and an odd difficulty change between the releases, the game is mostly the same otherwise. Now, why did I choose to play the game in Japanese? Well, the Western release has a very...
While you're at it, we need food and some money. Some fine wine will do nicely.
Interesting dub. Look, I'll get to that when I get to it. I do want to quickly mention my original intent was to play the game all the way through twice, but I didn't due to a few factors I'd like to get into now before the review proper. So at first, I started the game with the US version and then got a few levels in before then deciding that I'd rather play the game in Japanese after seeing that a fan patch for that release had been released super recently at the time of me playing these games. Plus, it is the original release of the game, and almost every other review of the game online is on the Western release anyway, so I figured why not. After beating the whole game in Japanese, with 90% of it being on normal, with only the last 10% being on easy because of this fairly annoying crowd of soldiers, including several archers, that I'll vent about later, I decided I'd try and restart the game on English to compare the two. I got a few levels into it, and I noticed that the game was harder on normal here than it was in the Japanese version's normal, and mixed up with something I noticed when I first booted up the Japanese ROM, that being that I saw in its options that it had the difficulty set to hard by default, which I initially thought was odd. I've come to a conclusion I'm not sure anyone else has made note of online before. Maybe they have, but I can't find it anywhere. The Japanese version of this game is easier than the US release, and since the US release was a year later, my theory at the moment is that Eidos or Yuke's or somebody decided that US audiences wanted a harder game, and thus made the game harder in a simple way. It kind of reminds me of how when DMC3 first released outside of Japan, it was harder than it was in Japan. Some people believe this was an accident, especially after the special edition release of DMC3 standardized the difficulty across all versions, but some believe it was on purpose instead. In DMC3's case, the US easy mode was Japan's normal mode, and their normal mode was Japan's hard mode. It's a similar situation here, with Sword of the Berserk's easy mode being the Japanese version's normal mode. When switching back to the US ROM after playing the whole game in Japanese, I noticed that my difficulty was set to blank on the option menu. Reminder, I finished the last handful of levels initially on easy, so if Japan's easy mode doesn't exist in the US version, it being blank on that version makes sense. This leads me to believe that the US version was just made harder. I assume the European release is the same as the US release, by the way. Now, as for the US hard mode, I assume that was a new difficulty made for the Western release, but I didn't touch that. This gets into my first point about the game, which is that I think if you're gonna play it, you should play it in Japanese. Certain aspects of the game's design aren't very good, and the game on harder difficulties can become exceptionally frustrating very quickly, as those higher difficulties really highlight a bunch of the game's issues, even making some of them worse than they otherwise would be. I think Sword of the Berserk adjusting the difficulty to be harder in the West didn't do this game any favors, honestly, especially as the years go on, and the game becomes harder and harder for newcomers to get into because of its nature as a pre-Devil May Cry 1 action game. Another thing is, I initially wanted to do 2 entire runs of the game, once in Japanese and then again in English, but no matter where I saved on the US version, it always would take me back to the beginning of the first level when I loaded it back up. Booting it back up on the Japanese version, however, this issue doesn't exist for me, and it even took me back to where I last saved on the US ROM. But the US version's save feature is now apparently busted, which I want to clarify, I am 100% sure is not an actual fault with the game itself, it is more so an emulation problem. So for me to replay the whole game a second time on the US release, the only solution I'd have at the current moment would be to play the whole game in one sitting. And if I'm being completely 100% honest with you all, I kinda don't want to do that. The last thing I want to do is play this whole thing again, except now it's harder, all in one go, without saving or stopping at any point. I just do not have that in me. But there is a theater mode in the game where you can watch all the cutscenes, so I was at least able to record a couple of those scenes in that version to compare the dub with the original Japanese, which I will be doing later. Now, some of you may be thinking, Mistress, why don't you just use the chapter select? Well, that would imply this game has any form of chapter select to fucking speak of. It does not, by the way, in case you couldn't tell. You could continue from where you left off via your last save, but you cannot replay levels on their own. You have to start a new game every time and work your way up to that point to replay a level. And sure, there's a way to rewatch any cutscene, and there's also a way to refight bosses, but there's no way to replay levels in their entirety, which is annoying. All that in mind, know that my review is primarily going to be on the Japanese game, which, as previously mentioned, was almost entirely done on that version's normal mode, save for the last couple of levels in the climax. I did fight the bosses from the climax in the battle arena, which is an extra mode where you rack up points and try to beat bosses under a time limit. I did that on the US's easy mode, i.e. Japan's normal mode, and I was able to beat both of Balzac's forms and even did another run of the Zod's fight, but the Mandrake baby was a bitch. I guess that would have been a bit of a roadblock for me if I had stayed true the whole run and never switched over. I do still want to try and cover aspects of the US release, such as its localization and dub, but for the most part, think of this video as a review of Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion, the game released in Japan on the Dreamcast. with only a brief couple of footnotes about Sword of the Berserk Guts Rage. They're both basically the same game anyway, so I guess it's not that big of a deal in the long run, and I probably shouldn't have spent so much time on this opening preamble. Well, anyway, looking at Sword of the Berserk, which I'm going to be calling this game that regardless of version because the Japanese title for this game is really long, admittedly, and I'm pretty sure you guys don't want to hear me consistently say Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion over and over again this entire video. I'm pretty sure one of you at least thinks it'd be really funny if I tried to do that, but I'm not going to. Anyway, you've probably noticed that visually, it shares a few similarities with none other than Capcom's original Devil May Cry, which would release in 2001 on the PS2, a year after this game's localization and 2 years after its initial release. It's got all the basics, fixed camera angles, the moody environments, the badass protagonist. A lot of this game, on the surface, will call to mind that first Devil May Cry game. But it's all purely from a visual standpoint because the game does not play as good as Devil May Cry 1, unfortunately. I don't think Sword of the Berserk is bad, per se. The game can be entertaining enough to play casually, and when it works, I'd argue there's some fun to be had with its simple combat, but it doesn't compare to Dante's first outing. DMC1 is a game people often throw under the bus, because it's the first game in that series, and it lacks a lot of the refinements and comforts that were added in games like DMC 3, 4, DMC, and 5. But I still stand by the opinion that DMC1 is a good game today and is worth checking out. It's just that DMC1 takes a bit more time to learn and get used to, given it was essentially the inventor of the character action subgenre of action games. I do want to briefly touch on a personal belief I have before going forward, which is that I do not believe games age. DMC1 is still the same game today as it was in 2001. It has not changed, thus it has not aged. The world around it has changed and aged, and since its release, other games have built upon its foundation in one way or another. But DMC1 itself is exactly the same. You've aged, the world has aged, that game has not. Roping this back around to Sword of the Berserk, I'm looking at this game understanding the context in which it was made. This was a pre-Devil May Cry world, a world where 3D action gaming was still very much in its infancy. I try to go into games like this trying to appreciate them for what they are, with the hope that keeping all that in mind will allow me to not only see the good in it, but also do a better job at criticizing what I believe it doesn't do as well as other games. I could easily criticize this game by modern standards and compare it to modern games or games that would come after, but I don't believe that's entirely fair. Now, back on the combat, it's pretty simple and kinda rough in a lot of places. Guts' moveset includes both with sword out and the sword up. When the Dragon Slayer is out, the A is a light attack while the B acts as a heavy attack. You can also charge the light attack while standing still to perform a spin attack. When the sword is put up, A becomes a punch button, and the B button becomes Guts' rapid fire arrows out of his metal arm button. Oh, yeah, Guts has an iron metal arm. If you haven't read Berserk, that probably just came out of nowhere and confused you. Also, if you haven't read Berserk, fucking read Berserk. I assume the idea was for you to be switching between up and out stances, mixing in attacks from both states in a combo sort of way. But that might just be the Devil May Cry fan in me inserting that and just assuming that, because that's just how my brain naturally rationalizes this kind of thing. However, when you hit the left trigger to pull out the sword, Guts will swing it in front of him, which does damage due to the sheer size of the blade. To me, this reads as a function that was added in order to add a bit more synergy between the two stances and thus encourage combo making, so maybe it was intentional. However, a part of me doesn't think this was the intent, not just due to the fact that Guts' movement isn't fast enough to pull off stance switching combos like that, but also due to an aspect of the game that I get, but I'm not sure if I like. That being that Guts' sword, the Dragon Slayer, if it makes contact with a solid surface such as a wall or a low roof or what have you, it will bounce off said surface and that will interrupt your swing. So, in my head, I believe the stance switching is really here because the intent is that in smaller spaces, the player will put up the sword and begin fisting enemies or firing arrows at them instead of slicing and dicing them. Guts has a few more moves worth noting, like his slide that can be activated by hitting the block button when moving, but he also has a jump which can be useful since you can do a jump attack with the A button while in the air, landing a strike down on whoever is in the attacking range. Also, if you hit A and jump at just the right time, you'll perform a spin move that, just like the jump attack, ignores all the rules of collision, which I didn't use at all until around during that final set of levels where you're storming Balzac's castle when I was first just going through the game. Here's something I noticed about this move. It seems to take a bit of Guts' health when performed. Every time I did it, Guts would lose a bit of health, and I had no clue how that was happening. But given the evidence in front of me, it seems to be the cost of performing this move, which kind of makes me wonder if they want you to use this move at all. I mean, I assume the idea was to make it so people didn't just spam the attack, since it, like I said, ignores collision rules. But it just seems, I don't know, too much, especially in harder difficulties where enemies just eat away at your health. Like I said, the combat is fairly basic, but Guts admittedly has a better moveset than I was expecting. The way I heard people talk about this game over the years led me to believe it was a very simple, kind of basic game with little in the way of moves to perform, but Guts has a solid moveset here. I still think it's a rather simple moveset, but on its own, it's a solid moveset to work with, and I don't know, I think I like it. One last thing to mention is Guts' Berserk meter, which fills both when you deal damage and when you take damage yourself. Because of this, the thing fills up really fast in combat. When it's filled up, that thing immediately activates like Dark Jack and Jack 2. You have no say as to when it activates. The game makes the choice for you, which didn't cause me many problems in my time, as it often activated when I was just in the thick of combat, which I assume was the intent. But the issue is that if this were to activate, say, at the end of a combat section during one of the linear point A to point B levels, then that means you'd be running with your super form active and nothing to go berserk on, and that's just really annoying to think about. I feel like being able to activate the form at your own call would have been a better choice. Building up the meter and saving it for when you need it most just works better in my mind, and I don't think that's an unfair thing for me to say. When in Guts' rage, your sword no longer reacts to collision, so now you can just swing your massive ass fucking sword to your heart's content with no resistance from silly things like collision. Also, while in this state, the world gets tinted red like Gotham City in the Bruce Timm universe, and you no longer take damage. Any damage Guts takes while in his titular rage is instead taken out of your meter instead of your health. The only other things in Guts' arsenal besides the sword are items, which you probably noticed on the screen during gameplay up in the top right. By holding down the right trigger, you can hit any of the face buttons to use the item sitting in that direction. There's fairy dust that, due to its HUD sprite, looks like a liquid of some sort that's the same color as Puck's glow, so I found myself referring to it as Puck Juice despite knowing it was fairy dust, which admittedly, now that I say it out loud, is a very gross idea, so we're gonna just move along. The other items include a special move relating to Guts' metal arm. It's a shotgun blast that blasts enemies back if they're in front of you, and usually kills them while you're at it. There's a throwing knife that exists. I don't see much of a point in it personally, but it's there. And then there's the Morningstar style bomb that, when used, Guts will drop, and a few seconds later it'll just blow up.
My main goal is to blow up.
These items are limited resources and can be refilled by either finding them hidden in things like pots in select levels, or at the end of a given level where you're rewarded some if you're low or out. You can't really do a lot with them given their limited supply, and I typically tried to save them for stuff like bosses or when I was low on health, especially the Puck Juice. Due to this limited nature, the purpose of their inclusion seems to be to help when you're in a bit of a jam and not to be mixed in with comboing. With all this in mind, I think the game has the makings of a solid action experience. Sure, it's nothing super fantastic or anything, but it could be a solid game, and sometimes it does feel like a solid game, but other times it doesn't. Like I mentioned before, a bunch of sections in this game are super cramped, and this requires you to put up the sword and rely on punching and arrowing enemies, but both of those attacks do so little damage when compared to the sword, I wouldn't blame anyone from trying to just brute force it and use the sword. But doing that leads to the sword constantly hitting walls, and thus bouncing off said walls, thus stunning you for a brief moment, which will leave you open to be hit. And again, on the higher difficulties, being hit eats at your health very quickly. The combat in this game is at its best in more open areas where you aren't interrupted by walls every 5 fucking minutes, and can instead enjoy playing with Guts' limited but decent moveset. But unfortunately, even situations like that have their own hiccups. For instance, near the tail end of the game, you're surrounded by a wave of soldiers and have to go, it's berserking time, so you can then berserk all over the place before you're then allowed to progress. Unfortunately, this area has more than a few archers. Archers in this game will fire at Guts and then run if he approaches. Guts has fairly slow movement when his sword is out, but putting it up to run towards them, then pulling it out takes time they could use to then get away, thus defeating the purpose of putting it up to get over to them faster. This isn't even mentioning that during this whole part, several other types of knights, including the double sword carrying type and spear wielding big dudes, who both have moves that can stun lock you, are also on your ass the whole time as well. As I mentioned earlier in the video, during my first playthrough, I eventually caved right around here and switched the game from normal to easy just to make it through this part, and even then I was kind of at the game's mercy at points. One part of the climax I was firmly ready to kick my ass was the part before the last two bosses where you, as Guts, have to run towards the screen a la Donald Duck's Going Quackers to evade these giant mandrake roots. This part, I heard from several other people in other videos, was fucking dreadful, and as such, I was truly dreading having to do this part. But as you can see through my gameplay, during my first playthrough in the Japanese version, I made it through this part on my first go, which stunned me. Though, after the fact, and upon realizing the Japanese version is easier than the US version that everyone else who's reviewed this game has played, I'm under the impression this section's a fucking bitch in the US version and not the Japanese version, but that's a guess, because I never got here in the US version, only in the Japanese version. What also stunned me was how absolutely easy the final fight against Ballsack was. I mean, seriously, the gross giant mandrake Naruto Smith boss took longer than Ballsack in his apostel form. That said, that final fight is super fucking cool visually, with Ballsack becoming this ungodly chimera while surrounded by an arena made up of an unending void and various eye cover rings that call to mind biblically accurate angels that were so much cooler before everyone knew about them. And holy shit, is this such a cool final boss setup visually. For some reason, though, it reminded me a lot of the second to last boss of DMC 2. You know, the one that's like this big amalgam blob of all the previous bosses in that game before it. Argosax the Chaos, that one. Whalley can put some footage of it up that he takes from someone else and credits in the corner. Anyway, Ballsack here reminded me of that visually. What with the multiple heads and the circling around him in an arena and whatnot, and that's a whole thing. Almost all the bosses in this game are not really memorable mechanically. Early on with the first boss, Job, yes, that is his name. Anyway, I had a bit of an issue because of his grab attack. A few bosses have those moves where they're barely, if at all, telegraphed, and getting hit by them trap you in an inescapable grab. I found the best strategy for most bosses in the game was to just bum rush the fuck out of them and hope you can do more damage to them than they can to you, pumping yourself on puck juice the whole time as to avoid dying. I gotta stop calling it puck juice. It's fairy dust, but calling it puck juice is funnier. The hardest boss is probably Zod, who's the only boss I actually had to pay enough attention to that I noticed their attacks and patterns. He still wasn't hard, thanks to the previously mentioned puck juice, but the point stands. Zod being here is kind of odd though, given where this game takes place in the timeline of Berserk, but Guts doesn't kill Zod here so he can escape and still make it to their eventual fight on a very specific snowy mountain. If you know, you know. Well, Zod is the hardest boss that isn't annoying because Naruto Smith, i.e. the Mandrake Baby, is kind of a bitch to fight. I redid a few bosses in the time trial mode, and as you can see here, I did not do so well against the Mandrake Baby. I'd also like to point out this game's checkpoint system. Upon dying, you can press start to respawn at a checkpoint, i.e. the beginning of whatever section you're on at the moment. These checkpoints also refill your items, so if you entered a room with no items, then dying and restarting a checkpoint will actually give you them. I noticed on higher difficulties you have credits, which would operate as lives, so that's a consequence for dying and worth pointing out, but on the easy difficulty in the Japanese version, there is no life system. Which, given how unforgiving this game can be even on its easiest difficulty, I feel just makes more sense. Dying in this game has more consequence than it does in something like Scooby-Doo in the Spooky Swamp, but that's not saying much, if anything at all, if you remember that game. Point is that it's a very forgiving system, and if you have enough patience, you shouldn't ever get stuck unless you're playing on the higher difficulties, in which case, yeah, there's a good chance you'll probably get stuck. I guess since I said all that, I should get into the voice acting part of the game, which is completely unrelated to all the gameplay, but I feel like I've covered that pretty decently. In Japanese, Guts is voiced by Nobutoshi Kana, who not only voiced Guts in the 1997 OVA, but is also the Japanese voice in Knuckles the Echidna, Leon Belmont in Castlevania Lament of Innocence, Takaya Sakaki in Persona 3, who you all probably remember better as that guy that sorta looks like White Jesus, and Bruford's voice in Phantom Blood on the PS2, which I discussed previously in a different video, among quite a few other roles. As expected, Kana's Guts is perfect casting for the character. His voice just screams Guts, and he really steals the show. It's a good thing too, given he's the character we spend the most time with. Yuko Miyamura plays Casca in Japanese, her other most notable role being Lark Sheen in the Kingdom Hearts series, but she has other roles such as being Chun-Li in games like Marvel's Capcom 2 and Alpha 3, as well as being Asuka Langley from Neon Genesis Evangelion. Miyamura was also Casca's voice in the 97 Berserk OVA. Unfortunately, Miyamura doesn't have a lot of lines in this game given Casca's current condition, but there is one scene where she gets to speak full sentences. I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to talk about that scene on its own later. Zod is also his same actor from the 97 OVA, that being the late, great Kenji Utsume, who is also the voice of Colonel Armstrong from Fullmetal Alchemist, Colonel Volgan from Metal Gear Solid 3, and Raccoon from Dragon Ball Z. Utsume is also Balzac's Japanese voice as well. I didn't realize that when playing the game. Honestly, he plays both characters differently enough that it is not noticeable. You've also probably noticed a pattern at this point, that being that characters in this game that were also in the 97 OVA have their same actors from that said OVA, which is a good thing as I feel all of those actors fit those characters really well. Which works as a segue to get into Puck, who wasn't in the OVA but is a character from the manga. So unless I'm mistaken, this game is the first time that little fairy bitch has been given a voice. Puck is played by Yuriko Fujisaki, who is a good actress with roles like Catherine from Super Robot Wars, Sig from Puyo Puyo, and even the Japanese voice of Ron Weasley in The Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets. The 6th generation video games on PS2, not the movies. But I don't really like Puck's voice in this game, personally. Not to say it's bad, but it sounds too high-pitched and girly for Puck in my opinion. It's just a personal take and not necessarily one I see a lot of people agreeing with, but it's just that, an opinion. I don't know. I wish she had been directed to sound a bit more boyish when playing him, but that's just me. The last VA and character I want to highlight individually, because if I went through every single voice in this game we'd be here forever, is Rita, a new and original character made for this game like Balzac and a handful of others. Rita is played by Yuri Shiratori, who was Maria Robotnik. She was also Princess Charlotte from the 1997 Berserk OVA, which is not Rita, these are different characters, so that's interesting. And she's also Yukina in Yu Yu Hakusho. Overall, the voice acting in this game in Japanese is pretty fucking good, and outside of my personal qualms with Puck's voice, I'd say the cast as a whole does a good job at not only performing, but selling their characters, and this extends to the actors I didn't spotlight as well. Fuck, I have to talk about the English version now, don't I?
Dove?
Akila, what are you doing here?
Well, I was wandering around the castle, but then I saw your wonderful ass. I saw you, and I just had to check on you.
Okay, that makes sense.
Is something bothering you?
No, just, you know, missing home is all.
I can see that. Would you like some company?
Are you offering to spend time with me?
Well, yes. You seem lonely, and spending time with me is a high honor. I couldn't possibly imagine anything better.
Sure, Akila. Honestly, it sounds nice. Beats staying in here feeling sorry for myself anyway.
Exactly. We can just spend some time together, cuddle up by the fire, and just lose ourselves in the romantic winter bliss.
Wait, romantic? Ow! You okay? Like, I'll be fine. Thankfully, Missy's totally fetch gift wasn't ruined. Here, let's go put it under the tree together. You know, me and Akila were going to spend some time together. Do you want to join us? Totally.
By the gods, I was so close.
To start positive, the voice acting in the dub is actually pretty solid overall. I can't pretend like I think it's great or anything, a lot of awkward line reads and strange direction choices that when put side by side with the original just do not compare at all, like here, watch this.
剣を収めて引き抜いたマンドラゴラを土に返して
何
Sheath your sword. Return the mandragora you uprooted to the earth.
What?
But this game has a great cast of actors. Michael Bell plays Guts in the dub, being the character's first English voice ever. You're bound to recognize Bell as he has several iconic roles under his belt, such as Sideswipe from Transformers, Duke from G.I. Joe, and Raziel from Soul Reaver. another Eidos published game. Bell's Guts is, well, fuck. He's not the best. When Guts is hushed and subdued, I think Bell's great, but he always falls flat in the more emotional scenes. Anytime Guts was screaming or pissed in the Japanese version, he's just not in the dub.
Bastard! Okay, sister. You heard her. Where's the tree? Hey!
Casca's first ever English VA is BJ Ward, who you all definitely know best for playing Velma in various Scooby-Doo products, such as the Mook animation era of films, Night of 100 Frights, and even Johnny Bravo for the crossover episode that show had with Scooby-Doo, where Velma was crushing really hard on Johnny. And now that I've said this here, I have now included the fun fact about Casca and Velma sharing an English VA in 3 different videos, and I'm pretty sure I will never get the chance to mention that fact again. So here we go, everyone. The trifecta is complete. Let's go! Woo! Anyway, like Casca's Japanese VA, Ward doesn't actually speak for most of the game, save for that one scene that I said we'd discuss later. I promise I'm gonna get to it. Don't think about it right now. I'm gonna get to it, okay? Peter Luray plays Zod in the dub, who you may remember as Hashirama in Naruto, Sabretooth in Wolverine and the X-Men, and he even filled in for the role of Solid Snake in Ape Escape 3 since it wasn't David Hayter. Lurie's Zod is... Look, he's a good actor, and he did the best of what he could with the direction and what have you, but I feel like Zod goes too hard into the gravelly and menacing, deep and raspy demon monster type of voice, and given the US version lacks subtitles, I checked when playing that version in the options menu, it's not there, and that makes the fact that sometimes he's a tad hard to understand way more annoying than it should be.
I sensed magic nearby. You're that branded swordsman's woman. Then he must be nearby.
Especially since the fan patch proves they could have programmed subtitles into the game from the get-go, but somebody at Yuke's just didn't, I guess. Also, looking into it, apparently the original Japanese version, unmodded, had subtitles as well, which means the Western release just chose to remove subtitles for a reason I cannot begin to fucking understand. Unlike the Japanese version, Balzac and Zod do not share a voice actor, though that doesn't mean the game doesn't have characters sharing voices. I'll get back to that in a moment. Balzac is played by Eric Bion. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that last name, my apologies. Who I know best for being the voice of LeChuck in the Monkey Island series, in Monkey Island 3 specifically. Although he did get to reprise the role for the special editions of 1 and 2, which, among other things, added voice acting, though he does not play him in the newest Monkey Island game, which is a choice. Bowen is a fantastic Balzac, and in my opinion, does a solid job at matching the Japanese voice in terms of sounding evil and menacing, though Bowen sounds almost exactly like LeChuck in this game, but I feel like it works, and he's definitely my favorite performance out of everyone in the English dub.
I've sent my soldiers to the village countless times since then, to get the heart of the great tree, but not a single one has returned alive. But we desperately need it for our research. I've seen your abilities, Gatsu.
Is it true that Guybrush Threepwood has found the 3rd piece of the map to Big Whoop?
Yes, sir. I was about...
Why did you not come and tell me yourself?
Well, I was trying to confirm that he really...
Largo! You have been my trusted henchman for many years, but I won't hesitate to drag your entrails from behind my ship if you do not bring me Guybrush before he finds that treasure!
Now we get to Puck. In English, he's voiced by Cam Clark, a man with many roles like Leonardo from the 80s TMNT cartoon, Liquid Snake from Metal Gear Solid, and even Male Corn from Fire Emblem Fates, which I feel like a lot of people don't realize. I do not like Cam's Puck either, and I think I like it less than Fujisaki's Puck, which I already kinda didn't like as is. The best way I can explain it is this. Remember Chip in Sonic Unleashed? Remember how Japanese Chip sounded like this?
本当の名前はライトガイア。昼と光の力を受けて星を再生に導くもの。ダークガイアからこの星を守るのが役目だったんだ。
And that voice was very cutesy and endearing, and then the English voice he sounds like...
My real name is Light Gaia.
I draw power from the day and light and guide the planet to its rebirth. My job was to protect the planet from Dark Gaia.
He sounds kind of creepy, like on Complete Accident, but he definitely sounds creepy. Well, Puck doesn't sound creepy in English, but he sounds like a grown man putting on a voice for a cartoon child in like the most stereotypical way possible, and it just does not sound right at all to me. Rita, our cool new character, is played by Paula Tiso, who was also both Orochi and Camilla in Fire Emblem Fates. Huh. What are the odds of that? As well as Fuka in Persona 3 and Sylvia Crystal from No More Heroes. Two characters I doubt any of you realize shared a VA until just now. Honestly, I think she does a solid job as Rita. There's a few strange line readings here or there, but that could literally be said about everyone in the dub. With the voice direction in this dub being handled by Chris Zimmerman of Metal Gear Solid fame, it's no wonder that the cast is so packed. However, I don't think this game really reaches the heights of her other projects. Chris Zimmerman was also the voice director for Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, Witch's Ghost, and Alien Invaders. So that's neat to know and kind of funny given BJ Ward. I don't think it's any secret that I think the Japanese performances are better overall. I'm not a dub versus sub person, and please do not mistake me for that kind of person over that comment. I usually find those debates beyond stupid. Do not take me saying any of this as me saying all dub's bad or anything. I just think the Japanese voices for this game are just better because while the English dub is fine, okay, maybe, sorta, not really, it's very much held back by a lot of awkward deliveries and a pretty bad localization in general.
I'm glad it's dead.
You murderers! You'll pay!
Shut up, stupid girl!
Damn you! He didn't do anything wrong! You didn't have to kill him!
I don't feel any mercy for monsters. Where's Casca?
Are you mercenaries? If so, you're strange ones. Traveling around with a woman in her state?
Oh no! Yikes!
The US version of the game also has to deal with, like I mentioned, a pretty bad localization. Now, typically, when people online talk about bad localization, they're either making shit up to complain about something they don't like, taking something out of context, or they're talking about something like the kinds of dubs companies like 4Kids were infamous for doing back in the day. This is none of those. Don't expect any jelly donuts or invisible guns here. Take a look at the world section. That'll help illustrate my point, because in the fan translation, it's actually pretty good and gives a decent amount of information. And then we look at the official translation in the US release and... What the hell is this? Why are some names in all caps but others aren't? Why is Zod's name spelled Zotto when no one calls him that in the game? Why is Guts' name right here, but in the actual game people call him
Gatsu
all the time in the actual game? Why does this section refer to the apostles as disciples? Why do they call the Band of the Falcon the Band of the Hawk? Actually, everyone does that one, even though the arc being called Millennium Falcon kind of says it clear as day that it would be Band of the Falcon and not Band of the Hawk, but you know, everyone just, I guess, accepted it was Band of the Hawk, even though Band of the Falcon is not only more accurate, but is also cooler. But the point is, the translation of this game is exceptionally sloppy and awkward. This is another reason I suggest anyone interested in this game play the Japanese release with that fan translation I mentioned previously. It's just more accurate and better overall. The worst thing it's got are like maybe a stray typo here or there in the subtitles. Then there's the scene differences. The big one being the scene where Zod shows up and confronts Guts. In the Japanese version of the scene, Zod says, which gets a very angry, which comes out like Guts wanting to scream in rage, but he's biting his tongue to avoid blasting Rita's eardrums because she's standing right next to him. And then Guts asks, this all makes sense given canon and what's happened in the manga so far. However, the US release has the scene go down like this instead. So, same basic setup. Zod's confronting Guts after landing on a dude. Everyone's surrounded by the burning village. Church is in flames. Rita's there too. Say hi to Rita.
Hi, Rita.
And Zod says in plain English,
I wanted to try you out myself, Kunigatsu. But I don't need the hawks to become human and defeat
now, at this point in the manga, Griffith has already returned to human form. Why is Zod talking like he's Griffith? These are two different characters. When US Zod says the Hawks, it seems to be in reference to the Band of the Falcon as a group, when Japanese Zod was saying the Falcon, which was clearly in reference to just Griffith. Doesn't help that Guts gives a very calm Griffith in response, which was one of those awkward line reads I was talking about, by the way, as Guts should be way angrier here, but Michael Bell's Guts consistently fails to get angry or yell when he really should. He often sounds like Jason Griffith's shadow, but that's not the point right now. After Guts, or Gatsu as this game is obsessed with calling him, calls Zod Griffith for whatever reason, he follows it up by saying,
"Planning on raising an army of monsters?"
Which very much confirms that this dub is apparently convinced Griffith is Zod, which, I mean, I guess one could argue that I'm making the wrong inference here and the wording is just super weird and that the game isn't actually trying to imply Zod here as Griffith, but I'm not sure if that works. I mean, if I'm wrong and they aren't trying to imply that, then the script is clunky and super vague here when compared to how the fan translation went about adapting this scene into an English script, which, you know, illustrated the point of the scene way more clearly by comparison. I just don't see why the localization would change Zod's line to refer to the entire Band of the Falcon instead of just Griffith. It just feels like an odd decision that muddles the water of what the scene is trying to convey, at least in my opinion. Now, with everything else said, I want to get into the meat of this game and what I consider its strongest aspect, that being the story of this game, penned by Kentaro Miura himself. Bless him. Though another writer is also credited alongside Miura, that being Tsuyoshi Tamai, who is credited as a scenario writer on the game. The only photo of them I could find is this one. That is in absolutely terrible quality, so I'd like to apologize to Tamai for that one. This next section of the video will be pretty spoiler heavy. Not just for the game, but for the manga as well. I'm going to try and avoid spoiling the manga as much as I can, but given this game's placement in the Berserk timeline, I feel like I'm going to have to spoil it here or there, regardless of what I want. What I'm saying is, this is your spoiler warning. I would also like to warn that this following section is going to cover the whole game's story, as I feel like if I didn't go into detail about the story, I wouldn't be doing the game's story the justice it deserves. So apologies if it goes on for a bit longer than you'd like. If you'd like to skip the story rundown, Whalley will put up a nice little time code for you to skip that, so you don't miss my closing statement afterwards. Anyway, the game's story fits neatly between volumes 21 and 22 of the manga. This means the game is right after the Conviction arc of the manga, which ended at volume 21, but right before the Millennium Falcon arc, again, reason why it's Band of the Falcon, not Band of the Hawk, which starts at volume 22 and will continue until volume 35. Due to this placement, the only people Guts is traveling with at the moment are Casca and Puck, as the group haven't met the likes of Sir Pecco, Isdro, or Farnese. Casca and Guts, after the events of the Conviction arc, are traveling together when they stumble across a group of strangers. These strangers are performers, the traveling kind, and are attacked by a group of bandits. You know, the typical setup for a fairly standard starter situation at the beginning of a D&D campaign. Our hero Guts... Our hero Guts... I know what I said. So anyway, our boy Guts whips out his massive fucking sword and chooses to just go fucking berserk on the bandits. I forgot to mention this, but the game has no tutorial, which I don't mind on its own. I like learning a game naturally as I experiment with the buttons to see what each of them do, and given Guts' fairly simple moveset, it wouldn't take long to realize what all the buttons do anyway, and get a decent grip on the game, though you'd probably not immediately realize stuff like the spin attack or the slide without some experimentation on your part. Anyway, after this beat 'em up, or I guess slice 'em up section, Rita introduces herself and Puck introduces our hero, Gatsu. I will shove you in a jar and toss you out of the sea if you don't fucking quit that, you hear me? Anyway, Rita suggests the group follow them into the nearby town to watch their performance, and while at first our boy Guts is just too cool for that, he gets this strange feeling and chooses to follow after them. Cut to the opening credits, then a scene in a town where Rita, alongside her dog, whose name I do not remember, as it's only said like once in the whole game, and her strongman friend Job as well, are just doing their jobs and entertaining everyone with their sick parkour flips. Sorry girl, but my boy Sora has the way better street side performance. I mean, just look at him juggling that ball and all of those sick kicky flips. The people of Twilight Town just love it. Job, during part of his routine, falls over and his mask falls off, which reveals that he has a second face on his chest. You should probably see a doctor about that one. This makes the town panic, and they start stoning Job for this. Rita doesn't quite care for this action, so she tackles one guy with strength I was not expecting her to have at all, and Job then hulks the fuck out. Our boy Guts, seeing a monster, is ready to fight, and we get our first boss fight. It's whatever. Anyway, Guts kills Job in this conflict, and Rita is pissed. She yells at Guts and tosses a knife at our boy, but he catches it in his fingers.
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
Guts is about to take his leave after stating that he has no mercy for monsters, but then the king of this fair town appears, and his name, as I've said multiple times and you probably still don't believe me, is actually Ballsack. Fun fact, one time I mentioned this game in a Discord server, and the first thing someone said in response was, isn't that the game with the dude named Ballsack? So I get the feeling this is one of the few things that everyone knows about this game. Anyway, Ballsack desires Guts' company after explaining what a Mandragoran is to him, and he also briefly accuses Casca of being one due to her state, but our boy shoots down that shit ASAP like a Chad. With that, our swordsman and his funky crew head to the lion-looking motherfucker's castle. In the foyer, Ballsack requests Guts follow him to the lower area alone, leaving Puck to watch Casca because that's kind of Guts' only option here. While Guts is down below, Casca and Puck stumble across a portrait of a woman we haven't seen yet, but we all just know is plot relevant due to this scene highlighting her. Meanwhile, down below, Ballsack explains his plan to our boy Guts, and it essentially goes down like this. Job was infested by something called a Mandragora. Thus, the name for these types of creatures is Mandragoran. It's then explained that the town has suffered this disease for quite some time, and down here, Ballsack reveals that he has a team studying the plant beings. Mandragora are plants, or at least plant-like, and when pulled out from the ground, they let out a scream that is guaranteed to kill whoever hears it or your money back. The Mandragora plant cures whoever's infected by it of all disease, but at the cost of their sanity, leaving them all in a similar blissful state to that of Casca's, which is why Ballsack accused her earlier back in the town. Ballsack then asks if Guts can go into the Mandragora-infested village, which is located out of his domain and thus out of his reach. Our boy Guts is skeptical of Ballsack's offer, but when the king offers our hero the possibility of curing Casca's condition, our hero decides to agree to his request in spite of his misgivings. This cutscene is actually pretty long. Like, so long that it's actually a handful of cutscenes back to back and not one cutscene. The game does this a lot, by the way. It's part of the reason I'm doing the story breakdown like I am. Anyway, a rebel group against Ballsack break into the castle almost immediately after this scene and kidnap Casca while other members release the Mandragoran prisoners that Ballsack has locked up in the same dungeon he does his research in for some reason. Don't question it, it'll make sense in a bit. We, as Guts, fight our way out of the dungeon and are then met with a panicking Puck who informs our hero of Casca's kidnapping. Hurrying along, Puck and Guts run through the town in the dead of night, making their way through various tight hallways that love to cause Guts problems when it comes to swinging his fucking sword, as the duo follow a dog who's leading them to the rebel hideout. Guts, at the entrance, is confronted by a trio of rebel guards, and just as he's about to moorball over... And just as he's about to moorb all over the place, their leader Dunteth stops him and informs his men that Guts isn't their enemy, something he had been informed of only mere moments ago by none other than Rita. That dog, the one our duo followed during the previous level, was the dog I couldn't remember the name of that did like one jump during that street performance. With Rita's reveal, she walks up to Guts and slaps him clear across the face.
何やってんのさあんた。見損なったよ。バカでかいもんぶら下げてご大層ななりしてるけど、女一人守れなくて何が剣士だい。
I like this scene a lot, honestly. At this point in the story of Berserk, the manga, Guts has essentially decided to protect Casca alone and push away others in an effort to shield himself from being hurt again, as well as avoid other people getting hurt. This story, in general, does a solid job of illustrating why Guts alone can never protect Casca the way he wants to, because no matter how cool or badass he is, at this point in the game, she's already been kidnapped because he wasn't there, and her only line of defense was Puck, who's the size of a Good Smile pop-up parade figure. Since this game takes place before Guts meets what would eventually become his party, I think this helps add a little extra to his story so that when he makes the decision to open himself up again to allow a party like that to join him, you see that progression even more. I'm not implying it isn't already there in the manga, because it is, but this game does add to it in a way that's nice to see. It isn't like those 5 million different Naruto movies that have no actual connection to the story and really add nothing to the characters or the world. This game's story actually adds additional content that helps strengthen what is already Berserk's strong narrative in the manga. Dunteth then explains that they have Casca, and they all head downstairs into the base itself. As they make their way down, Dunteth explains to Guts that his misgivings towards Balzac earlier were not unfounded. We learned that Balzac used to be a actually pretty cool guy, and people liked him. Then something changed, and he became a fucking tyrant. He also has been actively kidnapping Mandragorans and performing exceptionally inhumane experiments on them, not unlike Vought towards Homelander after he was born, all under the guise of research. Dunteth says Balzac is looking to use the creatures for war, which does line up with the whole evil tyrant vibe that he's got going on. The rebel leader also explains that they took Casca because they just assumed she was one of Balzac's test subjects and they wanted to save her from the fate that would have befallen someone of that title. Again, Casca's condition being compared to how Mandragorans act, because again, that's important. I promise it's important. It isn't just a convenient thing. I promise it's important. Please just stay and listen. Of course, what is meant to be a safe haven for the rebel group stops being one when Guts shows up. His brand leads to the dead rising from their graves. You know, Guts' brand, the brand of sacrifice, has been on his neck this whole time. Casca actually has one too, but we never see it in the game, as it isn't located on the back of her neck like Guts, but instead on her left breast. No, you're not seeing bare titty in this video. Stop asking. Point is, the brand attracts evil things like demons and whatnot to whoever have them, and thus causes trouble to literally always follow Guts and Casca. They also haven't met Fleora and Shirk yet. Am I saying that right? So they haven't got access to any seals that would temporarily null the effects, so trouble is always brewing. It kind of makes Guts the perfect kind of protagonist for an action game like this. If you ever need to rationalize monsters appearing out of nowhere looking for a fight, boom, Brand's the answer. So Guts fights on, eventually finding Casca a little deeper into the hideout, while also clearing it of its newfound monster problem. Guts then says he's leaving and reveals he's still going to run Balzac's errand even after everything he's learned, which angers Dunteth, who demands to know why Guts would even consider that when Balzac is such a despicable, awful, no good, very bad tyrant of a man. And Guts' response is simple. This doesn't convince Dunteth, who insists that Guts has no reason to trust Balzac and no reason to believe his story of a cure, but then Dunteth's wife, I assume they're married given they have a kid and all, shows up and insists that if the cure is real, then it could cure their infant child, who is also infected with the dreaded plant curse. She insists that they need Balzac's cure, regardless of his character or his morals or any of that nonsense, as it might very well be their only way. Dunteth's response is simply that while she may be right, he cannot accept it. There's no damn reason he should ever have to rely on the powers of someone like Balzac, someone who oppresses everyone else, including him and those he holds dear. He then knows that this town was built on the blood of their ancestors, remembering that only increases his inability to allow himself to accept any help from Balzac. Rita responds accordingly, calling out Dunteth for being so anal about what people in the past stood for and died for that he refuses to take something that could help many people as well as save his own damn child's future. As she puts it, it's the past getting in the way of that kid's future. Dunteth responds with, but Rita rejects this notion. Dunteth's only response to this is to ask point blank if Rita has any family, to which she is left silent. He takes this as a no, of course, and then explains she's just too young to understand, and that a day will come when she too will shed blood for something just like him. Rita, unable to argue, just runs away to another part of the cave, to which Puck and thus Guts and Casca follow after her. Here, Rita reveals that she took Dunteth's words to heart in a really bad way because she spent her whole life alone with no one really to bleed for. When asked about Job by Puck, she explains that she just gave him food one day and he never left. She reflects on how he was just like a kid, innocent and pure, and then mourns his death once more, but unlike last time where her response was anger and rage, it's much more somber and subdued. Guts takes this in, then apologizes for killing Job earlier, something that hours ago he saw no issue in doing and felt no remorse for. But now he sees the effect that action had on someone, how he took away someone's friend, and he apologizes because of that. Rita, in turn, acknowledges that Guts only did what he had to do. If he hadn't killed Job, Job would have certainly hurt Casca in the rampage. Rita, like Guts, is recognizing the other's perspective and taking that to reflect on how self-centered they were in that moment, even if both of their intentions were noble and honest. She then also apologizes for what she said earlier, calling back to her calling out Guts for failing to protect Casca. Guts, in this moment, reflects on Duntef's words and states that maybe the man has a point, and if he does, that means we've got to find something worth bleeding for. Duntef then reveals his presence and decides that he and his group will help Guts retrieve the heart, and they'll attempt to work with Ballsack, recognizing that it's a risk worth taking if it means helping the people he cares about. Duntef offers to leave Casca in their custody, but Guts declines, stating out loud only he can protect Casca, but decides to allow her to stay here near the spring, not only after learning it's a safe haven from evil spirits from Puck, but also after Rita offers to watch her like a hawk, which Guts finds amusing in a sort of endearing way. I have a small theory about this scene, by the way, it's just a theory. The fan patch translates Rita's line in the subs as watch her like a hawk. In Japanese, the word taka can mean both falcon and hawk, depending on the context. So I assume the fan subs decided to naturally translate this phrase to a very commonly used phrase in English. This makes sense, but I feel like there's a layer to this scene that's lost in translation. So the Band of the Falcon, which I mentioned earlier, was a group Guts was a part of back in the day, so I imagine that perhaps the reason he's endeared to this phrase is it reminds him of his old friends in the band. I don't know, maybe I'm looking too much into it, but that's how I took the exchange and it made me smile. With that, Guts leaves Puck and Casca in Rita's care and heads off with Duntef in his small search party. All goes well, Rita enjoying watching over Casca as she reminds her of Job. She then wonders if Casca's happy. I'd gloss over this piece of dialogue, but it's actually kind of important to one of the themes of the game, so I'll get back to that later. This scene is interrupted as Ballsack's men show up, with Mandragoran soldiers no less, as Ballsack had a piece of the heart that he had already been using, but it wasn't enough, which is why he needs Guts to get the whole thing. Anyway, Ballsack's right-hand man shows up and humbly requests that the girls come with him, not even acknowledging Puck, which is not the game forgetting he's there, by the way, that's important. Now let's check in with Guts and see how he's... Yeah, I'd say things are going fairly well on his end. Wouldn't you? You'd say so. Yeah, so Guts goes through all that and makes it to the Mandra village. And hey, look, Duntef isn't dead after all. I question how he and those two random rebels with him got here when I didn't see them at all during the actual game. But you know, that's just something we don't gotta worry about, I guess. So here, they see a village filled with those quote-unquote monsters and sees them living completely normal, peaceful lives. But then one of the nearby soldiers pulls out a mandrake plant from the ground, causing it to scream, and kills both of those nameless NPCs. You can tell they weren't important characters because their models have less detail and look worse than the named characters. Unfortunately, Duntef dies after surviving the mandrake scream because one of the monsters slapped his ass. Despite dying from blunt force, he also bleeds out of his back, which is... I'm sorry, does that make sense? It doesn't matter, as now we have to do some slaughtering. A nun shows up to stop us and tell us to bury the Mandragora back in the ground. Doing this reverts the monsters back to their more docile form. The nun's name is Ariza, and it's here we learn that the monsters can lead normal unaffected lives when left alone, only hulking out like Job when angered. So when Job hulked out in the town, it was in response to the people stoning him. Think about that. The people attacking Job for simply having that face growing out of his chest was what caused him to become a monster and thus forced Guts to kill him. If the people hadn't been so quick to attack him, Job would probably still be alive, but alas, that's not what happened. Ariza herself acts as an opposite to Ballsack. While Ballsack views the monsters as abominations, only useful as tools for him, Ariza views the Mandragoran like people, albeit different kinds of people. Following this path, while Ballsack sees Guts' skill at violence as a tool to get what he wants, Ariza is disapproving of it. Rita appears, which immediately signals alarm bells as her being here definitely means something bad happened to Casca, which it did! Guts, angered by Ballsack's actions, turns right back around and demands Ariza tell him where the damn tree is already. Instead, Ariza responds by telling Guts a story. This story is about a boy named Nico, who is a simple-minded but happy young boy. People bullied the boy for being different, throwing stones at him and generally being cruel and unkind to him, with the only reason being he was different. But in spite of that, the boy always wore a smile on his face as he was just grateful for the life he had. Until one winter, the crops he normally got his food from died out and no one would feed him. As a last effort, he fled to Arisa's church, but his entrance was drowned out by the bell. By the time she found him, the boy had perished. In his hand was a beherit. While Arisa doesn't even mention that, anyone who knows Berserk knows what that means. I think Nico's backstory is interesting. It not only explains why the Mandragorans act the way they do, but it also adds interesting context to Rita's story about how she met Job. You remember that, right? Rita just gave Job some food and he followed her ever since. That has new meaning now with this context in mind. Arisa insists that the Mandragorans are the same as Nico. They're pure and innocent. Guts, however, doesn't buy this shit for a second, considering they all just fucking murdered everyone he was with. But Arisa objects, arguing that it's because they broke taboo by pulling up the mandrake plant from the ground in the first place. In this scene, Arisa proposes a question. Who's happier? The people in the village, fully aware of themselves with all their fear, ambitions, and pain, or the Mandragorans, who live in this blissful and happy ignorance? Rita can't answer, but Guts remains strong, proclaiming himself to be another one of those humans. His full admittance to bloodshed seems to surprise Rita, and Arisa leaves without another word. After this is a scene with Puck breaking in to try and save Casca. I won't dwell on this scene too much, given it's not super important. All you need to know is Sod shows up, destroys Casca's cell, and then leaves because he senses Guts. This moment is important as it gives Casca the perfect avenue to escape, with Puck guiding her, of course. Also, before Zod's arrival, ghosts started appearing due to Casca's brand, and Puck did a very poor job of defending her. Once again, showing just how vulnerable Casca is without Guts at this point, and why him later acquiring a party will be in his best interest. While escaping, the two find Balzac's test chamber and are horrified. And then, they stumble across a very different room in an effort to avoid guards. This room, lavish and well furnished, houses a flawless young woman who acts exactly like Casca does. Puck assumes she's Balzac's daughter, since she looks exactly like Balzac's wife in the portrait. And of course, the duo can't stay here long as guards are looking for them, and they escape via a pretty convenient and lucky secret passage through a bookshelf. The bookshelf leads them to a jar with a strange-looking fetus inside it. The piece of the heart that Balzac stated he already had acquired, that's this fetus. Well, part of this. You know. Upon Casca pulling it out of the jar, Balzac enters the room and demands she puts it down, as it's his core. But it lets out a glass-shattering scream and begins to extend tendrils around Casca's body as the castle shakes. Balzac demands of his soldiers to take Annette somewhere safe, and the scene transitions to show that little fetus screams awaken the hostile forms of the Mandragoran nearby, and it also causes the seedlings to leave where they were buried and make their way to the castle. Hey, you know what? Let's go check back in with Guts and Rita real quick. You know, at this point, I should just expect this kind of thing, shouldn't I? Guts eventually finds the heart of the Mandragoran, and it's of course Nico with a part of his head missing, given the other part was the screaming fetus we saw in Balzac's castle. Arisa is also here, and it's revealed that she's also a Mandragoran. Guts fights Arisa the only way he knows how, with QTEs, because this game came out the same month as Shenmue in 1999, but this game came out before that game did, so this joke doesn't actually even work that well. Anyway, funny thing of note, my controller was being weird with the A input here for no reason, so I kept dying on that last of the 3 QTEs. Not a knock on the game, since I know it's not its fault, I just thought it was funny to bring up. After splattering Arisa's blood all over her place, we turn and face Nico, who seems to be a piranha plant main. We make quick work of him and then he's dead. Arisa then reveals she isn't dead and runs off carrying the young Nico in her arms, so we give chase. Back on the surface, Arisa recreates that one scene for Community as she finds everything up in flames and is horrified at the sight. Balzac's men have arrived and are laying waste to the village, with the help of those Mandragoran soldiers he's been creating. Realizing she's trapped, Arisa recites a prayer for the Lord to return both her and Nico to his side, and to also give these sinners a peaceful rest before running back into the burning church, deciding she'd rather die in the flames than by the hands of Balzac's men. As she runs in, Rita screams for her to stop. She also drops the Barrett during her run. Guts then demands to know what the big idea is, and Balzac's right-hand man explains that one of his men had been spying on him back when he first entered the rebel hideout. He then thanks Guts for allowing them to get here and slaughter everyone. This angers Guts. But unfortunately, these men have got him and Rita surrounded. And that's when Zod appears, killing a lot of Balzac's men with the rest fleeing. And then that scene I picked apart earlier happens. I'm not going to redo it because you already know what happens. The two fight and it's a draw due to Zod needing to remain alive so the rest of the manga can happen, and he flees. But not before mentioning to Guts that the branded girl needs him, meaning Casca. Rita calls Guts' attention and we see the Mandragorans begin to be freed from their curse, confused as to where they even are or what they've been doing this whole time. Rita, at first, is relieved to see that everyone will be okay, but that relief is short-lived when the free people take note of the dead bodies of those they knew lying around, people letting out screams at the loss of those around him. A child cries over their parents, and one woman immediately points the finger at Guts. The townsfolk agree with her claim and begin to pelt Guts with stones, proclaiming him to be a monster as they do so. But Guts, used to this, just turns away.
なんで言わないのさ。悪いのはあんたじゃないんでしょ。もうここにはいないんだ。幸せな人。
Alright, we're at the climax, so we're nearly done. I am so sorry this part is so long. This kind of thing is usually why I avoid doing beat-for-beat plot reads of games, and I prefer to do just general overviews while highlighting certain plot beats. But the game is so short and the story is such a major part of it that I couldn't really think of another way to handle this. All the standout scenes require so much context. This just seemed like the easiest way to go about it for this game specifically. And if you're still watching, I appreciate you. Returning to Castletown, Puck quickly catches Guts up to speed, and now it's storming the castle time. Like the climax of Shrek 2, our hero must charge through the town to make it to the castle and save the woman he loves. I would have played Holding Out for a Hero if I thought I could get away with it, but I don't think I could get away with it. Anyway, inside the castle, the crew meets up with that woman again. Puck quickly catches Guts up on who she is, and then the three with the new girl in tow make their way through the castle to try and reach Balzac, which means more fighting. Guts eventually makes it right outside Balzac's chamber, with just one more hallway to go, and fuck! Guts, with the power of another QTE, blocks the arrow strikes, and now it's time for combat. I'm not giving this one a montage. There's not enough fighting that happens here to warrant it, and Whalley's already done more than enough of those. Guts kills the crowd of archers and makes his way to Balzac's right-hand man, who fled after sending the archers after us. An intense battle happens here, where Guts is tasked with fighting a swarm of soldiers while also taking out the right hand of a man with an unfortunate name. After trapping him inside the collision of a door, Guts subdues the man and then makes quick work of all the other remaining soldiers before then kicking down Balzac's door. Guts demands Balzac bring him Casca, but Balzac is like, no, bitch boy, we had a deal. Balzac then laments that Guts is too late anyway, as neither his nor his own desires will ever be fulfilled. Rita then asks to know one thing: what changed? Why did Balzac go from such a caring and kind ruler to this sack of shit? Balzac then explains it all. When he was a younger man, he was truly a good ruler. He cared for his subjects while also caring for his sickly wife. No matter how much pain he went through, how many times he faced death, or how much he bled, he'd always stand firm and never falter. He was young, with people he loved, and thus people he wanted to protect. He truly believed he could carry that heavy a burden forever. But as the years continued on and on, time would weigh heavier and heavier on him. This sentiment confuses Rita, a confusion slightly amusing Balzac due to the girl's young age. But truthfully, time weighed down on Balzac more and more as it went on. He saw the land fall to ruin, wars rage on, his citizens impoverished, and his wife's illness never, ever getting better. All of these became too heavy of burdens for Balzac to bear. The expectations laid on him would grow to annoy him, and he felt even his own love had become a burden. The only thing that kept him going at this point was his dedication to the blood he shed. Remember the conversation earlier Guts and Rita had about finding things worth bleeding for? Yeah, but Ballsack became too enraptured by bloodshed and continued to give more and more into his violent urges and desires, so much so that it became the one thing he truly desired. And even that has now come to an end. Rita doesn't understand. Why isn't his daughter enough for him? Ballsack, in response, reveals that Annette is not his daughter. She's his wife. This revelation stunning everyone in the room. Annette is not aware of anything around her. Her memories taken away from her, including all the time Ballsack spent by her side and the love they once shared. A medicine made from the core was said to cure all illness, and using said medicine on his wife did in fact cure her of all disease, but froze her body in time, and robbed her of all her memories. As she is now, she'll continue to just smile aimlessly and laugh without reason, as she's forever trapped in this sense of childlike wonder and innocence. So while all of Ballsack's problems continue to pile up on him, he now must also carry the burden that is the loss of his wife, the wife he cared for all of that time. At this point, you're probably thinking what I was thinking, and you'd be right. Ballsack's situation with his wife parallels that of Guts and Casca. Much like Guts, Ballsack's love was taken away from him in a sense. However, there is one difference. Ballsack has fallen too far into his violent side and has thus lost sight of all that he once cared for. He slaps his wife to the side, proclaiming that all he has left is a blood-stained path. With this proclamation, he rejects his humanity, JoJo, and chucks down the vial in his hand of mandrake extract to become a monstrous version of himself that wields two massive spears that he just pulled out of his ass. We make quick work of him, and he falls without much trouble, dying by Guts' hand. How fitting. But it's not over yet. For a moment, Guts stands in silence as he takes in all that just unfolded before Puck brings him back down to earth, and he heads to where Casca is. Puck calls for Rita, who's stunned as she looks at the unknowing Annette standing over the corpse of the man that was once her husband. As Rita stumbles out of the room, she drops the beheaded. On their way, roots sprout from the walls, and that going Quackers type running towards the screen chase sequence happens. No, I'm not doing the joke again, I already did it, that'd be wasting time. Upon escaping the roots, our trio find Casca swallowed up in the custody of that giant mandrake baby monster. Guts, seeing only one solution, pulls out his sword and engages in a fight with the beast. Upon defeating the creature, Casca is freed, and for a brief moment, Casca regained herself due to being submerged in the mandrake, and she spoke to Guts once more. The moment was short-lived, and Casca would lose her sanity once again. When she's gone again, Guts can only hold her in embrace, as once again he's lost the woman he loves. The woman who, back in the day, was his light in a dark world that had hurt him. This scene probably doesn't mean anywhere near as much to someone unfamiliar with Berserk as a series, but if you've read it, you know why this hurts. This is also a scene the dub just doesn't do as well. Probably the biggest example of that in terms of performance. Again, this game's cast is made up of fantastic actors, and the voice director is someone with a great history, as all previously stated, but this scene just isn't strong dubbed. Guts doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of emotion as he does in the Japanese version. Bell seemingly not being allowed to yell at any point for no good reason.
Casca, Casca, hang in there, my love. Casca, you know who I am.
Gatsu, my dear, I was dreaming a really bad dream.
Casca. Casca, Casca. My love, come back.
Casca! Oi! しっかりしろ!
Guts.
Casca. わかるのか? 俺が!
Guts. 私、夢を見てた。悪い夢。
Casca.
Guts.
Casca. おいキャスカキャスカ
Guts doesn't have long to sit on his sadness, unfortunately, as his brand aches once more, and we cut to see Ballsack not yet dead. In his final moments, he makes a deal with the God Hand, using the fallen Barahet. He becomes the Chimera-type beast, and his throne room breaks away, turning into a void-like arena where the scenery resembles that of the biblically accurate angels I referenced earlier. It's a really cool visual, and the perfect setting for this final battle. Ballsack has sacrificed Annette so that he may become an apostle, an act that utterly disgusts and enrages Guts upon him putting 2 and 2 together. Guts draws his sword and begins this final fight, which is unfortunately not super hard and goes by way too quickly in my opinion. I even redid this fight in the time trials on the US version, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the harder version of the game, and even then it didn't take nearly as long as I'd want something like this too. Once the fight's done, we cut to Guts and company leaving the castle and returning to the town to see what remains of it after everything. We see some townsfolk beating down on a man who's been freed of the curse, pleading with them that he's not a Mandragoran as they beat him. Our cast walk past the scene, with Guts commenting that these are the kinds of vile creatures humans are. For a brief moment, Rita stops and looks on at the scene before running after the others. Outside of the town, Rita says her goodbyes to the crew and assures Puck she'll be fine on her own, as she's always been that way. Guts reflects on this state. Rita going from place to place like the wind alone, no doubt reflecting on his own vagabond lifestyle, and the Rita wonders out loud if she'll ever find something else. Something she wouldn't mind bleeding for. She then says, as a final note, that she'll never forget them, and Guts simply chuckles before walking away with Casca. Puck, of course, berates him for being so cold, but Guts simply tells the tiny fuck to shut up. The three walk away, and our final shot is Rita silently mouthing the words "thank you" to them. The credits roll, but once they're done, we get an MCU after credit scene where Skull Knight is shown in Ballsack's throne room, where he takes the abandoned Barahet, swallows it like a Flintstones gummy, and then rides his horse off the balcony to end the game. And that was Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Chapter of the Flowers of Oblivion for the Sega Dreamcast, otherwise known as Sword of the Berserk Guts Rage. The game is rough, exceptionally so if I'm being honest. Its best aspect is the story, as its themes and narrative fit in with the overall story of Berserk. Nothing in the game feels out of place and could all neatly fit into the canon of the manga no problem, even adding to the manga in places. Honestly, if we get an anime adaptation of Berserk that's actually good, I wouldn't mind them adapting this arc where it belongs in the actual canon. If you want to play the game after everything I've said, I heavily suggest playing the Japanese original with Vinny's fan patch, as the official localization from 2000 is not great, with a dub that, while not the worst I've ever heard, definitely doesn't compare to the original Japanese audio. But even then, the game isn't as good as it could be in terms of being an action game. It has a solid moveset for our hero, and when you have the context of this game predates the original Devil May Cry, I think it's easier to appreciate the game as it is, as a stepping stone, even if it's a little awkward and clunky, especially when compared to so many games that would release after it. Do I wish the game was better overall? Yes, of course I do. I think Berserk deserves a game that delivers on the promise that this game shows. The game is a story that fits perfectly in Rimuria's manga, making sense seeing as how he did write the game's narrative, but the gameplay is not only rough, only managing to be serviceable at its best, but it's also beyond irritating at its worst when its issues are pushed to the forefront, which happens a lot, especially on the higher difficulties. I think the game gets a lot more shit than it deserves though, due to the Western release not only ramping up the difficulty, which, as previously stated, only highlights its design flaws, but also with a butchered localization, with various problems, errors, and strange choices that unfortunately muddy up the pretty good story on offer here. I'm grateful for the fan translation, as it means more people have the chance to play this game with a more accurate script, and as a more tolerable experience as a whole. I honestly don't know if I'd say I like or dislike this game. I clearly have a lot of problems with it, and I think as an action game, I think it fails to deliver a truly great experience, especially since its gameplay portions are significantly less prominent when compared to the cutscenes. So much so, you'd think this game was a modern-day Sony exclusive. I don't know. Maybe it's my love of Berserk painting my opinion of the game, allowing me to overlook its flaws to appreciate the story it offered and its place in the history of this series that I love so much. This won't be the last time I talk about Berserk 2, as Yuke's would develop a sequel to this game in the form of Berserk Millennium Empire Arc Chapter of the Holy Demon War for the PlayStation 2, which was released in 2004 only in Japan. So next Christmas, I hope to cover that game in its own video. So I guess my conclusion statement on Sword of the Berserk is this. It's an exceptionally flawed game, and I wouldn't recommend it to you if you're just looking for a good late 90s, early 2000s action game. The PS2 alone has so many better games for you to play if you're looking for a good title. But Sword of the Berserk does offer another piece in the Berserk story that I believe is more than worth experiencing, at least once if you're a Berserk fan. Despite all my issues, I didn't hate my time with the game, and I can definitely see myself going back and playing it again in a few years' time, maybe even a few months. So if you like Berserk, you got a good chance of getting something out of this game like I did, even with all its issues, because even games with the most ridiculous jank imaginable can have something in them that's more than worthwhile. You just have to give them that chance. I want to end this review not with my final thoughts on the game, but with a piece about Berserk itself. Berserk is my favorite manga. Not one of my favorites. It's my favorite manga. It's a beautiful piece of work that shows its readers a dark and unforgiving world, but it tells us that there's always a reason to keep on going. Guts, our protagonist, suffers all kinds of pain and losses so much, but he keeps fighting, because despite what bad faith takes on sites like Twitter from people who've never even read the manga will tell you, Berserk is an example of a story that shows the power of the unstoppable, unmatchable human spirit. It's a story that shows us that no matter what we go through, what pain we are dealt with, what obstacles come in our way, or what we lose, there's always a reason to keep on living. Kentaro Miura passed away May 6, 2021 at the age of 54, taken away from the world too soon, and his passing was felt all across the world because Berserk is a story that has touched so many people, resonated with so many, and Miura gave us all of that in his short time on this planet. It's part of the reason I chose this game to talk about on Christmas, because I know firsthand that Christmas can be one of the loneliest and saddest times of the world. And I know what it feels like to see all the holiday cheer around and just not feel it. To be at the end of your rope and wondering if any of this is even worth it. I've honestly spent quite a few holidays feeling alone and like I had nothing. That I could just disappear and no one would care or notice. Berserk reminds me that it's always worth it. It's always worth living on, and I hope that putting this out there when I do on Christmas will hopefully help those in a dark place remember that, yeah, it is worth going on. And your life is worth living. Because that's something Berserk always does for me. I want to leave you with this. If you can handle it, because it is very explicit and does not shy away from sensitive subject matter at all, but all of that has a purpose. And that purpose is to show a dark and unforgiving world that damages and hurts everyone in it, so it can show you a story where a protagonist like Guts, someone who's been through the absolute worst, continues to fight and live on even after all of that, reminding us that we all have the strength within ourselves to keep going. I want you to read this. It's a beautiful piece of work. This piece of work that I'm so grateful for. I'm grateful that a manga like this was allowed to exist. And I'm grateful to the man who wrote it, the man who made it possible. Berserk is beautiful. There's nothing else like it. And I'm not surprised to learn how influential it has been and continues to be even today. So, this holiday, please remember that your life is worth living. Because no matter what you've been through or what you feel, your life matters. With that said, I hope your holiday goes well, whatever it is that you celebrate. And if you don't celebrate any holiday, then I just hope you have a good rest of your month. Until next time, put your glasses on, and I'll see you all next year.
First word should be finding whatever holds you back. I can't get it off. Tell me what you want. I don't know why you're afraid. Tell me what you said. Don't know why, it's too late. I've no fear for real, it's just a turning wheel. Once you start up, there's no other way. But your eyes and boots, step forward your roots. There's no aid, there's no trade, belongs to you. Before you miss something, yeah, then you should know what's the truth. tell me what you want. I don't know why, don't know why, don't know why you're afraid. Tell me what, tell me what, tell me what you say.